John chapter 9. John chapter 9 is where we will read in just a moment. Jesus and his disciples are walking along one day when they come across a man who is born blind. That's what happens at the beginning of John chapter 9. There's this man born in this condition from which we think maybe there's no hope of recovery, born with eyes that had some defect from birth that had left this man in darkness. And the disciples ask, why? Why? Why did this happen? They ask, had he or his parents done something, committed some sin that caused his blindness? Is this a punishment of some kind? And that's where we begin this story of the next miracle, which we'll look at in this series on the miracles of Jesus, with this question that makes us lean in a little bit to hear what Jesus has to say about this man's suffering. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? It was common during this time to assume that individuals suffered maybe illness, tragedy, blindness because of some individual sin. But because this had happened at birth, it raises the question in a particularly sharp way. I think the disciples are even struggling this. How could this be the result of sin? Was it possible for the man to sin before birth? It doesn't seem like it, but or was it the sin of the parents? How did this happen? And we hear Jesus' answer in verse 3 of John chapter 9. He says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." Then Jesus goes on to say, "I am the light of the world," and he's going to bring light to this man who's been living in darkness. Jesus says that this man's condition was not a punishment for sin. That's not the way that this works. Not all suffering is the punishment for sin. Now, is some of our suffering and some of our pain in life the result of the consequences of our own poor choices? Yes, sure. There is some suffering that follows sin in life. There are some consequences. The suffering of the world would be drastically reduced if humans would stop making self-destructive decisions. Yes, absolutely, that is the case. Sometimes there's a link between our sin and the consequences of our sin. However, sometimes there's not. There's not a link. And we should not assume that all suffering is a punishment. Some suffering is simply the result of living in a fallen world. And in fact, there's an entire book of the Bible devoted to this idea, dedicated to telling the story of a man named Job, whom God allows to go through an intense period of suffering, and he never really finds out why. But it's not because he did anything wrong. We're told that. That's like the only thing we're told. It's not because he sinned, and yet God allowed it. And we know that suffering is never outside of God's providence. Wherever he allows suffering, he is always at work within it for his own purpose. And that's sort of what we see here. We don't always get an answer to the question why, but here is actually one place where it seems like we get a little bit of an answer to the question why. In this instance, for this blind man, Jesus says that the purpose of this man's blindness was so that the works of God might be displayed here in this sign, in this story, so that it might unfold for us and be recorded here in John chapter 9. God had plans for this man's blindness. Those plans were way beyond what anybody thought or imagined. This man's story has been told billions of times as a part of the story of Jesus Christ. And then another billion times as a part of the song, Amazing Grace. And Jesus says, that's why. At least part of the reason, that's why. Because God had planned and prepared for what I'm about to do right here, which is way bigger than your questions. I'm going to do more than just explain why. I'm going to change the whole story into something amazing. And so we pick up in verse 6 after Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Verse 6, it says, after saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Now, it seems a little weird that Jesus rubs mud made with saliva in the man's eyes. It's a little bit weird. Did he ask the man's permission? Yeah, I think he probably did. It doesn't say that, but he probably did. But what Jesus is doing is replaying the creation story from Genesis 2. Where God breathed life into the man, having made him out of dust. And so out of the stuff with which we were made, Jesus is creating as God created, new eyes for this man. Jesus is putting himself in the place of the Creator, creating out of dust. Verse 7, go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed, and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. Hello, Sherlock. I guess I didn't see him. I was blind. Like, great investigative skills there. I have no idea. I did not see the guy. Can you imagine what kind of experience this must have been for the blind man, seeing your mother's face for the first time? Seeing your father's face for the first time. He may have knelt at the pool and seen the reflection of his own face for the very first time in his life. And instead of a celebration, the guy comes back to an interrogation. Instead of being the center of rejoicing, he's at the center of debate. And here's where the Pharisees come into the story and the conflict begins to intensify even more. Verse 13, they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Just to note, the focus on Jesus having made the mud here is part of the Sabbath controversy, because the kneading motion, like if you were going to knead bread to make a dough for bread, that was against the traditions of the Pharisees. So this kneading to make, not bread, but in this case mud, that's probably what the Pharisees would have thought was kind of against their tradition on the Sabbath. Verse 15, therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. So he's got to tell this again. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. I mean, how many times do I have to tell you? So verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. And now we begin to see the different responses that people have to Jesus. The response of the neighbors was like curiosity. They're interested in kind of finding out how this man can see. They want to know what happened to the man. They don't express any kind of belief, but they're asking questions. And then the response of the Pharisees is sort of divided. And all of these people are suddenly just trying to figure out, who is this man? Who is Jesus? And the response, on the one hand, some Pharisees reject Jesus immediately. They come to their conclusion immediately, because anyone who is from God must keep all of our Sabbath traditions. So Jesus doesn't, therefore he can't be from God. And they have a box within which God must operate, and anything outside of that box, they don't even pretend to investigate. They immediately draw their conclusions. But on the other hand, there are some other Pharisees who admit that, hey, I mean, anybody who can open the eyes of a blind man, I don't know, that must be from God. How would they do it without God? So they're divided. Now, the thing is, from here to the end of the story, we only really hear from the Pharisees who are opposed outright to Jesus. It's not until the very end of the story that the Pharisees, maybe who are in the middle ground, seem to show up again. And so we'll see that at the end. Verse 17 is where we are. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He's a prophet." They still didn't believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" And now this is the third time the how question comes up. As this time it's with the parents. And the parents are intimidated because they don't want to stir up trouble. Because if you cross the wrong people in this little interrogation, you might find yourself being thrown out of the synagogue, which meant that whatever relationships that you had, whatever marriages you were trying to arrange, whatever business deals you were trying to do, say goodbye to all of that, okay? The religious leaders had the power to ruin their life. So the parents just sort of passed the question back. Verse 20, "Well, we know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." And John tells us his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Key words in that verse there are who had already decided. They'd already decided about Jesus. Verse 23, "That was why his parents said, 'He is of age, ask him.'" Now, verse 24, a second time they summoned the man who had been blind. And they say, "Give glory to God by telling the truth." They said, "We know this man is a sinner." Now listen to this, what the man says. He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know. I was blind, but now I see." The Pharisees know so much that they are blind to what is right in front of them. They know Jesus is not from God. They know that Jesus is a sinner. And in light of all the things that they know, they miss the person who is standing right there saying, "I was blind, but now I see." This man who says, "I don't know much. I don't know who this man is. I don't know what your theological categories mean. I don't know about your Sabbath rules. I mean, the only thing the blind man knows, I was blind, but now I can see." In the midst of all the things that are unexplainable, there was one thing that was undeniable. At this point, the question that the disciples asked, where they wanted an explanation for why the suffering, why the blindness was there in the first place, none of that even matters anymore. Jesus has entered the story and transformed this man's life so that no one is even asking for an explanation anymore. Now the discussion is about who is this man? All of the discussions about, why and what the suffering was about. No. That's just turned into everybody is trying to figure out who is this man who can give sight to the blind man. All the questions about why and what and how come down in the end to the question of who is Jesus. Sometimes we all have questions that are bigger than we can understand, and maybe we don't have the answers for why. Maybe it's unexplainable, or maybe there are answers. Maybe you've been asking God why he let this thing happen to you, or asking God why he didn't prevent that tragedy or heal your loved one. We ask hard questions sometimes. That's okay. It's okay to ask hard questions. Maybe there are answers to some of those questions. Maybe we don't have the answers right now. That doesn't mean we won't have the answers eventually. Maybe we will. But when you don't have an explanation for why, don't walk away until you come back to the question of who. Who is Jesus? God doesn't give us an explanation for all of our pain, but he gave us himself. The light of the world entered into the darkness because that's what people need in darkness. They don't need an explanation for the darkness nearly as much as they need light. It's what people need in darkness. The response of the man is simple faith in Jesus, despite all the things he doesn't know or can't explain. And then the rest of the story is just this back and forth between the response of simple faith and then the response of stubborn unbelief on the part of the Pharisees here until the very end. And there's kind of a little bit of a twist. So let's read this section until we get to the end. Verse 26. Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I've told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Now that was the wrong thing to say. No, they don't. Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are the disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable, even more remarkable than a blind man seeing, maybe. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind." He's just saying there's no Old Testament reference for this. I mean, this didn't happen in the Old Testament. Blind man seeing, right? So nobody's ever heard of this. Verse 33, "If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, say that with me, when he found him. Yeah, Jesus went looking for him. He said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. I love that. I believe. In light of all the things he didn't know, he believed because there was something he couldn't deny. And then we come to the final twist where the Pharisees, who were sort of on the middle ground earlier, they seem to show back up in the story. Verse 39, Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were there with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." What a way to end this chapter. You know, up until now, most of the story has been the back and forth between the man who believes in spite of all the things he doesn't know and those who stubbornly refuse to believe in spite of everything that's right in front of them. But at the end, there's some other Pharisees who were there. Now, maybe some of the ones, it's some of the ones from earlier who were divided. I mean, we don't really know. I mean, but some of these Pharisees are there with Jesus. They hadn't made their minds up yet, apparently. And what the language here implies is them saying, "We're not blind too, are we?" They're picking up on this, like, is Jesus implying that, wait, we're not blind too, are we? And this is where we find out that the miracle Jesus performed was not just some random miracle, it was a sign. It was pointing to something. Jesus healed this blind man on the Sabbath in order to reveal the blindness of the religious leaders. This was a sign. The blind man receiving sight is the thing that reveals the blindness of the religious leaders. The problem with the Pharisees is that they claim they can see, even though Jesus is implying they're blind. That's what Jesus tells them. Because you claim that you can see, your guilt remains. Jesus is saying your problem is that you think you can see. If you would come to grips with your blindness, then you wouldn't be guilty. But your problem is that you don't realize how blind you really are. You have constructed a system that assures you you are healthy when you are sick. And so what can be done for these people? What cure is there for those who reject the only cure? The people who know that they need healing, well, they're willing to cut a hole in the roof to get to Jesus. But the religious leaders who thought they were fine, that had no desire to come to Jesus. We're fine, even though they're blind. Did you know that this can happen? Did you know that you can be so steeped in religious things that over time you grow callous to God's voice through familiarity? Like a blindness of familiarity for some who maybe have grown up in church, they've always just been around things of God over the years. Your heart can become desensitized or callous to the message of Jesus Christ. It doesn't have to, but in small ways, in small ways you turn your heart away from God's voice, and your heart over time can become callous. Not because they don't know the message, but because perhaps they know it too well, but have neglected its power for years and years and turned away from God's voice little by little. This can happen. And you owe it to yourself this morning to ask, am I listening with a desensitized heart? Have I just been steeped in religious things and because of the familiarity become a little bit callous to God's voice, a little bit insensitive to God moving in my heart? God, is there a blindness to seeing you and your work and your beauty, and a hardness in my heart towards understanding your truth, and a deafness in my ears towards hearing your voice? Have I become callous through familiarity? It can also happen that, like the Pharisees, you can intellectualize Jesus. Make Jesus so he's something to learn about and analyze and study. But in doing so, you keep him at arm's length. Has this happened? Has Jesus become an object of study or interest, or you ask questions, or maybe even digging into, some things about Jesus, but you keep Jesus at a distance by just making the gospel a matter of mental agreement? Maybe there's a long list of things you believe that you would agree with, but if it only engages the mind, then you're only playing a superficial game with Jesus and not actually embracing him. That kind of intellectual Christianity alone, intellectualism is not necessarily bad, but if it's intellectual alone, then that's no Christianity at all. Because the power of the truth can never have its full effect in your life until you trust with all your heart in the person of Jesus and encounter him personally, so that you can say with the blind man, in spite of all the things I don't know, I know this. I was blind, but now I see. The blind man knew that he didn't have to explain everything in order to believe something. And you don't either. You don't have to explain everything in order to believe in something. You probably believe in love. Can you explain that? In the end, believing actually leads to the man seeing more than anyone else. The only person in this story to whom Jesus fully reveals himself is who? It's the blind man. The only one who gets the full story about Jesus from Jesus' own mouth is the one who accepts Jesus and trusts him on his own terms. It's the blind man who believes. That's the one who is told at the end by Jesus. He gets to hear Jesus say, I am the one. I am the Son of Man, prophesied long ago. Believing leads to more and more understanding, not less. Believing doesn't lead to less understanding. Believing leads to more understanding. It's like C.S. Lewis said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Believing Jesus means seeing everything else properly as well. You see more, not less. And so we get to the end and we get a sort of riddle from Jesus where he says, for judgment I have come into this world. What does that mean? It's a little confusing maybe. For judgment I have come into this world. There are two other places in John's gospel where Jesus actually says, I didn't come into the world to judge it, but to save it. So why this? Is this what is Jesus saying? What this means, I think, that Jesus didn't come into the world to judge it, is that Jesus didn't come into the world for the purpose of condemning sinners in their sin. That's not why he came. He is not coming to condemn sinners. He is coming to save sinners. But in the process of his earthly ministry, on the way towards the cross where he would purchase our redemption, there is an inevitable separation taking place. A judgment is taking place based on how people respond to Jesus. And that's part of the twist of the whole story. It's that the whole time these different groups are discussing Jesus and analyzing Jesus, asking questions about Jesus' actions and thinking that they are passing judgment on Jesus, and they are not. It's the other way around. When a person is confronted with Jesus, that person is not in the position of making a judgment about Jesus. That person is all of a sudden in the position of passing judgment on himself. If you see in Jesus nothing to desire, nothing to admire, nothing to love, then you have judged yourself. You have condemned yourself. You have put away from yourself the only cure. What cure is there for those who reject the only cure? You haven't passed judgment on Jesus, you have passed judgment on yourself. If you see in Jesus something to respond to, something to reach out to, someone to worship, then you are on your way to God. Can you imagine someone who claims to be the dividing point of humanity? Can you imagine someone who has the right to divide the world into those who are seeing clearly and those who are blind to true reality? Who gets to divide the world? Jesus is that person. Jesus divides the world into those who come to the light and allow it to change and heal and direct their lives, and those who resist the light and choose to remain in darkness, while at the same time declaring boldly that they can see everything in the dark, when really they're blind. The central question which divides humanity is the question of Jesus. You see, the whole story began as a question about the suffering of a man, but Jesus shows up and reveals the real question is about him. Because the question of human suffering, the question why, is ultimately dependent on how you answer the question of Jesus. You can never know the why until you figure out the who. Who is this man who gives sight to the blind and claims to be the light of the world? Because if Jesus is alive, then I may still ask why God would allow my pain or my struggle. But I know that on the other side of suffering and darkness and death is what? Resurrection. If Jesus is alive, then on the other side of all the darkness is life and light forever. Jesus' answer to suffering is the cross and an empty tomb, which shows us the pattern is after death is new life. After suffering, after darkness is life. You may still grieve the pain of this life, but not without hope. That's Jesus' answer. And I can tell you, if this whole thing is just theoretical to you, if it's just ideas and propositions and something you agree with, or agreed with once, that will not carry you through the darkness and uncertainty of life. What will carry you through the rest of your life is not a faith that's theoretical, but a faith that's experiential, where you come to know deeply the one in whom you have believed. And maybe that's your story this morning. Maybe you want it to be your story. To say, I don't know how to explain everything. I don't know how every piece of the puzzle fits together, but I do know one thing. Something happened when I met Jesus. It's like I was blind, but now I see. If it's not your story, it can be your story. Let's pray.